Welcome, everyone, to Forbidden Love in Old Virginia. I appreciate your being with us. It looks like we have taken care of the technical glitches and are good to go. I am Sheila Budoff with Arlington County's 55 Plus Travel Program. This program is being recorded and will be posted on the 55 Plus YouTube channel as time permits. Our speaker will be spotlighted, so he will be the only one who appears in the recording. Also, I'd like to let you know that the program is being offered through the Virtual Center for Active Adults, VCAA platform. VCAA is a partnership of Northern Virginia jurisdictions that provide free virtual programming for older adults and adults with disabilities in our area. And now I'd like to introduce our very special guest speaker for today's program. He is Jim Hall, and Jim is an award-winning journalist and popular speaker on Virginia lynchings. His book, The Last Lynching in Northern Virginia, Seeking Truth at Rattlesnake Mountain, was published by the History Press in 2016. His newest book, the one he'll be discussing today, Condemned for Love in Old Virginia, The Lynching of Arthur Jordan, was published by the History Press very recently in July 2023. Jim has a master's degree from Virginia Commonwealth University and is a former adjunct instructor at the University of Mary Washington. A native of Falls Church, he is retired and lives in Fredericksburg. We will leave time for questions at the end. You're most welcome to enter questions in the chat as we go along. But unless it's urgent, we will address them at the end. Okay, so we are good to go, and I'm going to turn the program over to Jim Hall.
Thank you, Sheila, very much. It's my pleasure to be with you today. I am I'm a native of Falls Church, as Sheila said. I'd like to introduce myself. I attended St. James Parochial School in Falls Church, and I graduated from O'Connell High School in Arlington, and spent all my formative years in the Northern Virginia area. Left to attend Virginia Tech, graduated from Virginia Tech with a degree in economics, worked for a number, graduated from VCU with a master's degree in mass communication, and worked a long time, way too long, as a reporter and editor for Virginia newspapers. I'm retired now. I retired in 2013, and I immediately did exactly what I didn't think I would do, and that is continue to write and study. And the result of that is two books. The first one in 2016 by History Press, and the second one this year by History Press. They are, my topic is lynching in Virginia, especially. The subject of my master's degree thesis was how Virginia newspapers covered lynching. And that launched me on this deeper dive into these two cases. The first book was the 32 death of Shedrick Thompson in Fauquier County, 1932. And this later one is the 1880 death of Arthur Jordan, also in Fauquier County in Warrenton, the county seat. Okay, Sheila. I would like to just offer a bit of a preface here before I get started. This is born from an experience that happened at the University of Mary Washington when I was speaking to a history class there. One of the students became very upset because she mistook my interest in this topic for support of this topic, of this practice. And so now I'd like to begin with a bit of a disclaimer or a bit of an explanation, and to say that my interest in this topic does not mean that I support what happened in the South and in Virginia some 100 and some years ago. I absolutely oppose it. It was mob rule. It was chaos. It was unchecked murder. It was contrary to all laws and social standards throughout all time. Historians are advised not to carry your beliefs and prejudices, your moral code back in time, because it was not necessarily the code that existed at that time. But I'm happy to do that because there were plenty of people at the time, including John Mitchell, pictured here, who opposed vigorously what was going on. Mitchell was a former slave in Virginia and became eventually the editor of one of the most successful and largest Black-owned newspapers in the nation, the Planet. He spent much of his career and placed himself at great risk to oppose lynching. He opposed it vigorously, week after week after week in his newspaper. He called on state and federal officials to do their job and bring these murderers to justice. Unfortunately, almost all the time they never did. But he is a person from that era, one of many who spoke and acted vigorously to try to stop this madness. So we study this topic, as Auntie Anna said, to try to avoid repeating it. Sheila? My plan this afternoon will be sort of if you could picture that I would like to start wide. I think of it as starting wide, talking about lynching in general, lynching in the United States in general. Then I'd like to narrow the focus just a bit and talk about lynching in Virginia. And then I'd like to narrow it one more time and talk about the lynching of Arthur Jordan, in hopes that if I can explain in detail one case, it might help illustrate all cases. And it's always a good place to begin is with a definition. And I define lynching as mob murder, execution without due process by those who think that they are acting in service to the community. Sheila? Lynching was an action perpetrated against Black people, almost exclusively against Black people, and almost exclusively against Black men. White people were lynched, women were lynched, but they are a very tiny percentage of the total. Sheila? Where did it occur? It was a Southern phenomenon in many, many respects. The states of the old confederacies where it occurred most often. You can see that it occurred everywhere in the United States, but the frequency in the South is multiples of all of the other locations combined. Sheila? If you take a closer look at the southern states, you see that Mississippi led the way in the most often. This is a raw count, not a per capita count. It had the most, followed by the other 11 and 12 or 12 states of the old Confederacy. There is many theories as to why this occurred in the Deep South. It was also the home of plantation agriculture, and where large work gangs were supervised by individuals. And the local authorities seemed to surrender control to these landowners in many ways. And remember, lynching was practiced against former slaves, people who were slaves at the time. Virginia, as you see, appears less often on these lynching lists. And Virginia and North Carolina are almost always at the bottom of these lists. But perhaps there was less plantation agriculture going on in Virginia, smaller slave holdings. Maybe Virginia was quicker to charge and execute suspected criminals, and there's some notion that Virginians and North Carolinians have maybe a greater allegiance to law and order, and for that reason, more likely to let the authorities handle situations. Sheila? But Billie Holiday was exactly right when she sang that southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood on the root, a strange and bitter crop. Billie, Sheila? Why did it occur? That is I answer that question in three ways. The first way I choose to answer it is the answer you would get if you asked the perpetrators, if you asked the lynchers, why did you do this? And their answer was about 1/3 of the time, the victim is alleged to have committed a murder. And another third of the time, the victim is alleged to have had inappropriate sexual contact with a white woman. Sheila? But that leaves 1/3. And though that 1/3 could be anything or nothing. There were Mitchell at his Richmond Planet kept his newspaper carried a chart every week listing the names of new lynch victims and the reasons that given for those deaths. And the variety of reasons is really sort of astounding when you start looking through that list. There were several World War I veterans returning in 1919 from the overseas who wanted to wear their uniform in their southern town, and the white power structure within those towns refused to allow blacks to wear their uniforms. And more than one person died as a result of that one, insisting on wearing the uniform. As you can see, there are violations, suspected violations, alleged violations of more of the social code rather than any laws. Sheila? To me, this is the third and the real reason that lynching occurred. It was the white power structure wanted to maintain social, political, economic control over their black neighbors, and they were willing to use terrorism to do it. You remember that the Deep South featured many localities that had a black majority population. So if true democracy was to evolve in the South, if the slaves were truly free and full citizens of the localities in which they resided, they would have a numerical majority, a voting majority in those localities. And the white structure was not about to let that happen. And they were willing to use violence to maintain their position. Sheila? How did victims die? The popular perception is that victims died through hanging, and that was the case many times. These are an example here. This is the Shorter case of 1893 outside of Winchester. Shorter was accused of sexual conduct inappropriate sexual conduct against a white woman. And the sheriff in Winchester realized that there was trouble brewing. And so he had Shorter shipped to one of the nearby localities to be placed in the jail there. He sent his deputy to return with Shorter back to Winchester on the day of the trial. And a mob greeted the train, stopped it, boarded the train, grabbed Shorter from the deputy, and hanged him from a tree right outside the train in full view of all the passengers. But lynching, the hanging was not the only way in which blacks were lynched. This is on the right is a 1905 case from Luray, Virginia. This was about a man who had the misfortune of being on a train traveling from North Carolina to West Virginia. And he made the mistake, without knowing that he was making a mistake, to step off the train and stretch his legs when they got near Luray, Virginia. Luray had an unwritten rule that blacks were not allowed. And this man did not know that. Of course, he was from North Carolina. But when a mob saw him, they started chasing him. He ran from the mob and tried to cross the Shenandoah River on a dam there and fell to his death, drowned in the river. Sheila? How many died? That is a question that's very difficult to answer. Historians choose to examine different numbers of states. They choose to examine different time periods, and some look at only Black victims, and some look at Black and white victims. So you get a different number every time. And the two best numbers, in my opinion, are Tolnay and Beck, two of the original researchers that wrote about the phenomenon. And they counted about 2,800 victims, again, using the southern states and that 1882 to 1930 time frame is a popular time frame with historians. It's when the best of the records are available. The Equal Justice Initiative is a civil rights law firm in Montgomery, Alabama, headed by Byron Stevenson. We'll learn more about him in just a few minutes. But they decided, Byron Stevenson decided that he wanted to study lynching. He thought it was a phenomenon that was not accurately understood. And so he assigned each of his attorneys, civil rights attorneys, to go to one southern state and do research, to look in museums, libraries, archives, to talk to people and see if there were unreported cases of lynchings. And they found them. And he believes that there were 12 in the 12 southern states, between a wider time frame than Tolnay and Beck, but he found what he believed was at least another 1,000 uncounted cases. Sheila? No matter the number, it is an astounding number, and it is, as Tolnay and Beck said, it is an average. When you average out what happened, you find that a Black man, woman, or child was murdered nearly once a week, every week, by a hate-driven white mob for a period of 50 years. To me, that is just an astounding number, that this lawlessness, that this violence occurred over a long period of time and with such great frequency. And you can imagine the effect it must have had on the surviving Black community. Sheila? Virginia, as we said, the numbers were lower here, much lower than in the other southern states. But still, when you talk to Dr. DeFazio, Gianluca DeFazio at James Madison University, he's done just a remarkable job of collecting lynch data for Virginia. He has established a database that is publicly available, lynching in Virginia, terror. I forget his exact title of his database, but if you Googled Virginia lynching DeFazio, I'm sure it would pop up. He counts 100 incidents in Virginia. He's pushed the envelope back a bit to 1866. And he ends with the 1932 case that I wrote about, the Thompson case in Fauquier. 115 victims during these 100 incidents. Obviously, there were more than one victim in many of the cases. Sheila? About half of Virginia's localities had experienced a lynching. 63 of them did. 26 of them experienced more than one lynching. The worst case was a 1893 case in Tazewell, where local miners came into town on a Saturday, got drunk, and according to the newspaper accounts at the time, got drunk and the whites retaliated against them, and it ended up with 6 of the miners being hanged. The picture you see there is from Mitchell's newspaper. White-owned newspapers did not run lynching pictures, but Mitchell did. He wanted you to see what was happening. You shudder at the thought, he says. In that case, that picture on that instance was from 1891 in Clifton Forge, Virginia, where 3 men were hanged. Sheila? It would be easy perhaps to blame the phenomenon on the mountain people of Southwest Virginia. You can see that the first 3 localities that are with the greatest number of lynchings, Wise and Tazewell, are all out in the Southwest. But I urge you not to come to that conclusion, that lynching was a phenomenon throughout Virginia. Central, northern, Tidewater, all localities, all regions experienced it. You can see Fauquier and Loudoun were among the most frequent victims. Lynchings occurred most frequently in Northern Virginia, in Fauquier and Loudoun, but it occurred everywhere throughout the state. Sheila? As you can see, here's examples from a number of localities. Emporia, Roanoke, the Lavender case in Roanoke had 2 very disturbing incidents involving large crowds. Charlottesville, the Emporia case was the governor of Virginia sent troops to try to prevent it. The troops stayed for a while, then left, and as soon as they were on the train headed back to Richmond, the lynchers invaded the jail and brought the 2 men out and lynched them in the courthouse green. Amelia Courthouse, and then Culpeper has had a couple cases as well. Sheila? Northern Virginia, according to Dr. DeFazio's database, has been spared this phenomenon somewhat. As far as I can tell, there were no recorded cases in Fairfax, in Falls Church, or in Prince William. The most prominent cases, the only cases in Dr. DeFazio's database, are 2 cases from Alexandria. And these have been well marked, well noted. One was Joseph McCoy, 97, and the second was Benjamin Thomas, 99. And the 2 cases are remarkably similar, even though they were 2 years apart. They both involved 2 young Black men, teenagers, I think in at least one of the cases, and they were both accused of assaulting white girls. Both were removed from the city jail by mobs, and both were hanged downtown from lamppost. McCoy at the corner of Lee and Cameron Streets, and Thomas at the corner of King and Fairfax Streets. Their bodies were mutilated, as happened often after death, and no one was ever held responsible. Sheila? My thought about lynching, this phenomenon, it is almost tempting to wonder why it happened. What I believe it was not a strange vapor of miasma that settled over the South and over Virginia, affecting all residents and driving them to madness to murder their neighbors. Instead, it is a phenomenon. It is a part of our long and difficult tradition or history of racial relations. Of course, it began with slavery with the beginning of the colony of the United States. some date slavery to about 1619, the arrival of the first slaves at Jamestown. Some date it a little bit later, maybe 1650. By either date, we can see that slavery lasted well over 200 years. We have been a slave nation longer than we have been a free nation. Our Black citizens have been in bondage. We're in bondage longer than they have enjoyed the rights of citizenship. Lynching then fits in immediately after the end of slavery, when the white power structure refused to relinquish control. And then in later years, in the 20th century especially, we see state sanctioned disenfranchisement. We see state sanctioned segregation. We see, I'm old enough to remember when Virginia closed several of its schools rather than integrate. So it was a program of massive resistance to civil rights. And it continues on to this current period, which seems to me to be a very difficult political climate in which racism is freely expressed again, as strange as it may seem. Sheila. So we narrow one more time, and that is, let's take a closer look at the case that is featured in Condemned for Love. It took place in Fauquier County, Virginia in 1880, and the principals are Arthur Jordan and Elvira Corder, both 25 years of age. That is the farmhouse where Elvira lived, that picture there. Sheila? They began a romance. Arthur was a farmhand on the Corder farm. Elvira was the oldest child and only daughter of Nathan Corder and Elizabeth Corder. She had 3 younger brothers, and she and Arthur began a romance. It was an impossible love in many respects. Arthur was already married, and Arthur was the father of an infant child. He lived a short distance away from the Corder farm. Elvira became pregnant during their romance in the spring and summer and fall of 1879. Their response to that was to flee. They believed, I guess, that their best hope from this impossible situation was to flee to Western Maryland, in Washington County, Maryland, Hagerstown and Williamsport area near the Pennsylvania border. Sheila? I've never been able to figure out why they chose that area. Perhaps Arthur knew someone. I don't have any idea. I would love to know. But they did end up on a farm, the family owned by a family named Shupp, S-H-U-P-P, and they lived and worked on the farm. And they appeared to be very happy there. They've traveled frequently into Williamsport for social occasions, but that was their downfall, those public appearances. Someone in Williamsport saw them and was offended by this sight of a Black man and pregnant white woman enjoying themselves in Williamsport. And he wrote 2 letters back to Virginia. He wrote one to a man that he had heard was one of Arthur's former employers, and he wrote the second to the postmistress at Markham, which is the village in which the Corders lived. And he said to whoever opened the letters, if you're looking for a mixed race couple, they're here. If they appear to, we don't know why they're here, but they're not welcome here, is basically what he was saying. Though one of those letters eventually made its way to Elvira's father, Nathan, and he recruited his neighbors. They rode north 80 miles to Williamsport, crossed the Potomac River on the ferry there, and stayed in Williamsport for the first night with the letter writer. Sheila? Early in the next morning, they traveled a few miles north of Williamsport to the Shupp farm, and they got the drop on Jordan, who was cleaning the stables. And they shackled him and put him on a horse and got ready to head for home. Elvira saw what was going on from the house, and came running out and tried to stop it. And she was so upset by what was going on that the one newspaper account said one of the young men in the group of riders from Virginia tried to comfort her, and she was not to be comforted. She insisted that they stop, that they leave them alone, that she was not a victim. She was there of her own choosing and wanted to be there. Of course, her father wasn't going to buy that. And I suspect that instead of risking the long ride home with both of them, he chose to place Elvira in the Taylor Hotel in Williamsport. And he asked the innkeeper there, Mr. Taylor, to look out for her, and that he would return for her, and then they would take the train home because of, quote, her delicate condition. What we have learned, there's much history recorded about what happened to Jordan, but Elvira absolutely disappears from the public record. On the way home with Jordan, the riders stopped in Winchester. They had gone about 30 miles, and they stopped in Winchester, I believe, to get supplies, because they stopped outside of a hardware store in Winchester. Jordan started screaming for help, and that attracted quite a crowd. It was an unusual scene to see 7 armed riders leading a shackled black man, and he was screaming for help, and it drew a crowd. The 2 policemen in Winchester, then the riders realized they were in a tough spot, and they tried to spur their horses and leave town. But 2 policemen were attracted by all the commotion and stopped them. And the black residents in town, Jordan said, "I'm being kidnapped, help me." So the black residents in Winchester went to try to get a lawyer, and the 2 policemen then took the group, the riders and Jordan, to a local judge. And he listened to all the stories and sided with the riders. He deputized one of the riders, and he instructed them to take Jordan immediately to jail in Warrenton in Fauquier County. The black residents found a lawyer to help them, went running back, but they were too late. The riders and Jordan were already gone. Sheila? They placed Jordan in the Warrenton jail, the Fauquier jail, the county jail in Warrenton. And 4 nights later, a mob of about 40 riders arrived in the middle of the night at the jail. And they used a trick that was repeated often during the lynching era. Remember, this is 1880. This is the beginning of the lynching era. According to Professor DeFazio, Jordan was the 11th Virginia resident to be murdered. And as you can remember, there were about 100 more that followed. So we're at the beginning of the lynching era, and we see the practice, the mechanics of lynching being repeated many times in later years. And one of them was the way in which the mob captured the prisoner. If the prisoner, in this case, the mob banged on the jailhouse door in the middle of the night. Horace Patty was the jailer, and he lived upstairs in the residential portion of the jail. And he said, "What do you want?" And they said, "We have a prisoner from Rectortown." So he came downstairs, unlocked the door, and they brought in Jordan. They brought in one of their own who was made to look like a black person. Patty testified at the coroner's inquest the next day that he thought their prisoner was a black person. It turns out they basically sort of bum rushed Patty There were many others hiding around the corner, and they came in to the jail as well. And they forced Patty to turn over the keys. They unlocked a cell and removed Jordan. And they dragged him about 5 blocks to the Warrenton cemetery. Sheila. And there they lynched him from an ash tree towards the back of the cemetery. We have this drawing. It is one of the few artifacts of the Jordan case. It was done by a local physician, Dr. Augustus Gustavus Horner. He was notified, he learned at breakfast that somebody had hanged a black man in the cemetery overnight. He ran to the cemetery, and he was an amateur artist, and he sketched this scene. With the help of Kirk Goolsby, a Warrenton resident, we were able to identify the ash tree was still standing until about 2 years ago, when it was diseased and removed by a city crew. It's a city-owned cemetery. But they were, the cemetery is accurately portrayed by Horner, and it does portray Jordan hanging from an ash tree. He was cut down. There was a coroner's inquest, and he was buried in that cemetery in the colored section, what was referred to as the colored section of the cemetery. And as this is the case with many, many lynchings, no one was ever held responsible. I think the numbers are in the 90% of lynchings in which no one was ever arrested for murder. Sheila? The Virginia General Assembly was in session while 2 days was in session at the time of Jordan's death. And Delegate Page from Norfolk stood and asked for an investigation. He asked the governor to send representatives to Warrenton to post a reward to investigate and figure out who was responsible for this man's murder, and to arrest them and try them. And Delegate Payne, who represented Fauquier at the time, was a Civil War hero and an attorney in Fauquier. He rose and he said words that must have discouraged both Page and many other Black residents of Virginia at the time, when he said that when something like this happens, I turn my back and I shut my eyes and let the proceedings continue. In effect, he excused lynching, and the assembly applauded and voted in favor of tabling Page's motion. All the white delegates, save one, voted to table, and all the Black residents, I think there were the Black representatives, I think there were 13 of them, voted against it, hoping for an investigation that never occurred. Sheila? And I don't want to end on a down note. I want to end with this telling you about Bryan Stevenson. Bryan Stevenson is a really remarkable man. He's a criminal defense attorney in Montgomery, Alabama. He has founded the Equal Justice Initiative in 1989. He's also the subject of a feature film called Just Mercy, starring Michael Jordan and Jamie Foxx. It's excellent. He turned his attention to lynching several years ago, as I said, and he has brought, I think he's completely changed the conversation about lynching. Sheila? He has established in Montgomery, it's a wonderful museum, National Memorial for Peace and Justice. There's a pavilion there in the town, in the city of Montgomery, where there are these steel boxes. And these boxes are, there's 800 of them. There's one for every locality in the nation where a lynching occurred. The names are carved on these boxes. There's 4,400 victims carved and visible in that you can walk through that pavilion there. But Stevenson did something I think remarkable. He created, this is a privately funded memorial. He arranged for duplicate boxes to be created. And so out on the yard outside the memorial, you see a box that is the replica of one that's hanging in the pavilion in the background there. And what he has done is he's issued a challenge to the localities in which lynching occurred. He's saying to them, come and get your box. Come and get your box. Take it back to your locality and prominently display it to let your residents know what has happened and, as a way of remembering those who died. I don't know the exact count of the those who have taken up the challenge and gone to get their box, but what Stevenson may not have anticipated was that his message got through, Sheila. His message of truth and reconciliation. And he believes that the two concepts are sequential, that we have to have truth before we can have reconciliation. And that's his belief, is that we acknowledge what happened, and only then can we create the kind of world that we all want to live in. And I think Stevenson's message has resounded throughout the regions, Sheila, and it has resounded in ways that maybe he did not anticipate. The Virginia General Assembly in 2019 passed a measure that said that Virginia acknowledges with profound regret the lynchings that occurred here. And it called on, if we go back to that one, it called on the state government to create a database of all who have died. And the state adopted Professor DeFazio's database as the state database. And they have instructed the Department of Historic Resources to remember victims in an appropriate way. So now what you see are these metal historic history signs that are on the sides of the road, have now been also turned to remember lynch victims. There's been 5 of them. Erected throughout the state, including the most recent one, which was to remember James Carter in King and Queen. It was just a couple months ago. But Sheila, the concept of local involvement, I don't think is practiced greater in any locality than it is in Alexandria. Alexandria has taken this notion of local involvement of remembrance, of documenting and remembrance to amazing levels. They have created the Alexandria Community Remembrance Project, and they see it as their job to document and remember victims of racial violence. They have held ceremonies and marked the anniversaries of the deaths of McCoy and Thomas. They've collected soil from the lynch sites in Alexandria and carried it to Alabama to a place in Stevenson's display of soil. And the volunteer members of the project have written a chapter in Professor DeFazio's new book, Lynching in Virginia. I did a chapter as well. I'm very proud of our work. The book comes out in the spring of 2024. It is published by the University of Virginia Press, and it has about 11 chapters by different lynching experts. The Community Remembrance Project in Alexandria has a chapter in it in which they document some of the work they've done. Sheila, I thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, we have a couple in the chat. I'm going to take a look at them. First, we have it's a comment, actually. Lynching was a way to maintain their society as a result of losing the Civil War. Control with fear.
Control with fear and violence.
Yes. And then for lynching in the North, I guess the question is, by North, do you mean like New York City North? Were there lynchings in New York City?
I'm not as well versed on the lynchings that occurred in the other portions of the country, but it did. As you can see from Professor Brundage's list, there were lynchings in many, many other states.
Also, it appears we have one person who has visited the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and she says it is well worth visiting.
I agree. It is a remarkable memorial, remarkable. The effect of walking through it with these suspended steel boxes is overpowering. You can't believe that this many people died.
It is amazing, yes.
Yes.
And that it happened in Virginia.
Yes, indeed.
We all think Virginia is so progressive now, and it is getting more progressive, but
it is a dark chapter in our history.
Okay, here we have another question in the chat. What was and is the reason that you think such hatred was held by the white slaveholders against slaves? Do you think it was entitlement or just because they could do it?
Ooh. There was a belief among slaveholders that the slaves were subhuman. They were not social, political, economic, personal equals. They had a place. Black slaves had a place, and that blacks had a place, and that place was one of subservience. There was a strong belief on their part that that slaves were subhuman. It's stunning, but it was prevalent. I'm sorry, I'm not answering that as well as I might, but it's a difficult question.
Possible question, yes. Yeah, but okay, we do have another question. Yes, George.
I was going to say, in regards to what we were just talking about, these individuals that thought it was horrible that they lost the war, and they were going to do anything they could to maintain a certain amount of control over their society. And there was no way that they were going to tolerate certain arrangements that existed before. They couldn't do anything about the fact that they lost, but they could try to maintain a certain amount of control over the blacks, just like they were maintaining a certain amount of control over women. So it was their way of continuing their authority and their way of life, and there was no way they were going to allow this this race. I don't know if they thought that they were subhuman, but they surely didn't think that they were entitled to the same rights. I mean, they were appalled that they were going to get the vote, and some of them did right after the war. But it was definitely a difficult time. The problem was around 1880, the North decided to abandon Reconstruction and let the South do whatever they wanted. It was an arrangement that you pull your troops out and we'll support you in some other way. So
I agree. I agree with all of that. I agree. It was a matter of control. You can imagine if you had been the dominant caste within a society, it would be difficult to surrender that power. And they weren't about to surrender that power, and they were willing to use violence to maintain their spot.
Now, the couple that you were just describing that were caught and trying to get away, they would have been able to be successful if they traveled separately and to get to New England, where that type of activity was accepted. So I don't know if they didn't have that option, but maybe he could, but maybe she couldn't. But being white, she should have been able to get to the north. So I think a lot of them did that. They say, I'll meet you at a friend's place in New England and we'll go from there. And they thought that they could travel together, which was a major tip-off of what was going on.
It was a romance that would have been acceptable in many other times and many other places.
Yeah,
it was their misfortune in a way. Maryland was just as strict about racial relations, and especially across the color of the relations between a black man and a white woman. They were just as strict as Virginia was. So they didn't go to any place of sanctuary. They might have thought they were, but it turns out that it didn't take long and somebody betrayed them.
So we have a comment in the chat about someone asking whether this attitude of dehumanizing Black people still continues to this day, and she's pointing to the killing of George Floyd.
I don't have, there to me, it is still a difficult topic. It is still our original sin. It is our time on the cross. We have not made peace with a multiracial world. We've got a ways to go.
Yeah. And I guess the next question, well, we see dehumanizing the other in many different parts of the world, and it's carried all over.
There seems to be some desire on the part of some to be superior to others. That's necessary.
And then another question was just what happened to the woman? And I think you had mentioned that we don't know what happened.
I would be very surprised if we ended here today without that question being asked. It is the most frequently asked question by far. And I wish to heck I had an answer for it. I devoted 5 years on this project. I hired 2 professional genealogists to help me. I traveled, I interviewed, I spent countless hours in courthouses, diving, ruined my eyesight looking at old records. I don't know. I think we have two references to her later life. We have one, of course, when she was abducted with Jordan and placed in the Taylor Hotel in downtown Williamsport. And then we wait almost 10 years, and there's another one. And that one is her father filing his will in the Fauquier County Courthouse. And you can tell from the document that he had the help of an attorney. And it is written in a formal language, but he makes a division of his land holdings. He was by that time, one of the more wealthy residents of Fauquier, had 300 acres of valuable farmland. He divides his holdings among his wife and his 3 sons. And that is the top part of the will is taken up with those provisions. And then midway or towards the bottom of the will, in my opinion, it reads as if the attorney says to him, well, what about your daughter? you've got to mention your daughter here. And so he does. In one of the paragraphs, he says, this is not to, I have not forgotten my daughter, Elvira. I bequeath to her and any issue that she may have had. First, he says that she died in Maryland. He does not say where or when or how, but he says she died in Maryland. And if her issue still, if there is one of her, a child, of course, she was pregnant at the time, he bequeaths to that child 1 penny. It struck me that the attorney insisted that he acknowledge this person and designate some portion of his estate to this portion so that this portion couldn't come back later and say, well, what about me? I'm a rightful heir. So those are the only 2 references we have to her. I examined many, many possibilities. The quarters early on, a strong group of them, a large group of them, moved to Missouri and began a life there. And uncles and aunts of Elvira's father, brothers and sisters of Elvira's father, her aunts and uncles. And I wondered if she had been shipped to Missouri to have the baby and live. And she's not there. She's not anywhere. I think my final conclusion after years of working on it and having good help is that they murdered her, that it was an honor killing, that they either did it themselves or had it done and killed her. And they were not about to bring her and that mixed race baby back to their home.
What a tragedy and what a sad, shameful chapter in our history. Makes us realize we really are a young country. We've, still have a lot of learning to do and a lot of growing to do, a lot of reckoning to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, sir. One fellow has his...
Yes. I'd just like to make a comment about the question about Floyd. That incident wasn't caused by the same things that caused lynching, but the way to really look at it is how often does that occur with a white person? And it doesn't happen. They know that there's a general feeling that you can get away with it. Maybe it's a gradual thing. There was a little bit of control, and then it just snowballs. Well, I got away with it this way. I'm going to go a little bit further. And that's the difficulty. But I think it's definitely the fact that there isn't sufficient understanding among the police force often. I mean, they are amazing contribution to our society, but too often individuals get into the police force and they may have some subconscious way of reacting to things. It could be with their wife or kids, neighbors, and that's a convenient way to exert their dominance over somebody. Usually, in fact, almost exclusively, it's a Black person. So I don't think that it has changed a lot in some degree. It's for a different cause, but because it's no longer trying to control your way of life, but it's a reaction to get away with something that maybe there's such thing as sadism out there, and it's unfortunate that we can't weed it out before we put people in responsible situations.
Yep, I agree.
I just also think it's worth noting that these lynchings were government sanctioned, or the government agreed to look the other way. It was supported by the states, at least in the South.
Yes.
Fortunately, with the civil rights movement, in the 60s, that has changed, and you still have people who think a certain way, and but at least the government isn't supporting them in their actions. So maybe we're making some progress.
There were many Southern sheriffs who quickly surrendered their prisoners to the mobs. After looking at this case, the Jordan case, I don't think Horace Patty did that. I think he did as he said and testified to, and resisted somewhat. I mean, he made a calculation that he wasn't about to give his life trying to protect Jordan, and he believed that his life was at risk. So he did surrender the keys, but I think there was a resistance on his part that you did not see in many other cases.
Right, definitely. Okay, we've gone a little bit over. I'm just wondering, do we have any more questions? Anybody else going once? Okay, I think that's it. I would like to thank you very, very much, Jim. This was fascinating, and I appreciate it. We need to learn about our history to avoid repeating it, and this was really a tremendous learning experience, and we appreciate you sharing it with us. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us here on Zoom. We appreciate it, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day.
Yeah.
Here and be well.